mysterious tale from ancient Korea's hidden past. What happened to King Damascen's lost throne? Where did the ancient shamans hide the sacred artifacts? When did the gods last walk among mortals in the Korean mountains? Who were the mysterious priests that vanished without a trace? How did an entire dynasty disappear from all historical records? Welcome to tonight's story. Welcome to tonight's journey through the mists of ancient history. This is your bedtime story, designed for sleep and rest. You don't need to remember anything from this tale. Simply find a comfortable position, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander through the forgotten corridors of time. The audio will gradually fade after 50 minutes, guiding you gently into sleep. Tonight, we travel back to the Korean peninsula over 2,000 years ago, when the boundaries between the mortal world and the realm of spirits were thin as morning mist. This is the story of a kingdom that history forgot, a throne that vanished, and secrets buried so deep that even the mountains themselves have grown silent about them. In the year 37 BCE, according to the fragmented records that survive, there existed a small kingdom nestled between the larger powers of Goguryeo and Baekje. The Chinese chronicles mention it only in passing, calling it the Kingdom of Whispered Stones. Korean shamanic traditions speak of it in hushed tones, referring to it as Simbowi Nara, the land of divine mysteries. The kingdom was ruled by a line of priest kings, who claimed direct descent from Wanong, the divine prince who descended from heaven to rule over humanity. These rulers were said to possess abilities that blurred the line between human and divine. They could speak with the spirits of the mountains, predict the changing of seasons with perfect accuracy, and heal ailments that no earthly medicine could touch. King Damascen was the seventh ruler of this forgotten dynasty. His name appears in only 3 historical documents, each giving contradictory information about his reign. One Chinese trade record describes him as a king who speaks with the voice of thunder. A Buddhist monk's journal mentions the ruler whose eyes reflect the depths of ancient wisdom. Most mysteriously, a shamanic chant preserved in the Jeju Island oral tradition refers to him as the last bridge between heaven and earth. Archaeological evidence suggests that Damascen's capital was located somewhere in what is now the Taebaek Mountains, though no definitive ruins have ever been found. Local legends speak of a city that could only be seen at dawn and dusk, when the light played tricks on the eyes and revealed structures hidden during the brightness of day. The kingdom's prosperity was built on its unique relationship with the spiritual world. Damascen's court included not only human advisors, but also shamans who claimed to channel the voices of mountain spirits, river gods, and the souls of ancient heroes. Foreign traders reported seeing rituals where the king would disappear into a sacred cave for days, emerging with knowledge of distant events and future happenings. What made this kingdom truly unusual was its approach to governance. Rather than ruling through force or fear, Damascen's authority came from his perceived connection to the divine realm. Citizens would bring their disputes not to earthly judges, but to the king himself, who would enter a trance-like state and deliver verdicts that were believed to come directly from the gods. The palace itself was described in fragmentary accounts as a marvel of ancient engineering and spiritual architecture. Built into the side of a sacred mountain, its rooms were carved from living rock and decorated with symbols that seemed to shift and change depending on the observer's state of mind. The throne room was said to be located at the heart of the mountain, accessible only through a series of tunnels that followed the natural energy lines of the earth. In the center of this hidden chamber sat the throne of whispered stones, a seat carved from a single piece of black jade that was said to have fallen from the heavens during the kingdom's founding. The throne was surrounded by 5 standing stones, each representing one of the cardinal directions, plus the center, the place where earth meets sky. These stones hummed with a low, barely audible frequency that visitors described as soothing, yet unsettling. The throne itself was more than a symbol of royal power. According to the shamanic traditions, it served as a conduit between the human and spirit worlds. When Jameson sat upon it during important ceremonies, witnesses reported that his voice would deepen and resonate as if speaking from a great depth. His words would carry weight beyond their literal meaning, and his judgments would be accepted without question, even by those who disagreed with them. But the most remarkable aspect of the throne was its apparent ability to preserve and transmit knowledge, consisting mainly of warrior monks who combined martial skills with spiritual practices. These soldiers were trained not only in combat, but also in meditation, divination, and communication with protective spirits. They were said to be able to move through the mountain forests like ghosts, appearing and disappearing at will, making the kingdom nearly impossible to conquer through conventional means. Trade was conducted primarily through barter, with the kingdom offering rare minerals, medicinal herbs, and handcrafted items in exchange for goods from the outside world. But the most valuable exports were not material. Foreign dignitaries would travel great distances to consult with Jameson's shamanic advisors, seeking guidance on matters of state, predictions about harvests, or healing for ailments that defied conventional treatment. The kingdom's unique position between the physical and spiritual worlds attracted not only traders and diplomats, but also sanctuary for those who lived on the margins of society, healers, fortune tellers, and keepers of ancient wisdom that was being forgotten in the rush toward political consolidation and military. The sound of wind chimes made from jade and silver, hanging from the eaves of temples carved into cliff faces. Picture the soft glow of oil lamps reflecting off polished stone walls, creating shadows that seemed to dance with lives of their own. The story we're about to unfold is one of mystery and loss, of power that transcended the merely human, and of secrets that were buried so thoroughly that they have become legend. It's a tale that asks more questions than it answers, which makes it perfect for drifting off to sleep. Let the uncertainties and mysteries wrap around you like a comfortable blanket as we begin to explore what happened to King Jameson and his mystical throne. The shaman's prophecy. The morning mist clung to the mountainsides like the breath of sleeping dragons as King Jameson made his way to the Chamber of Echoes, a sacred cave deep within the palace complex. It was the autumn of what we might call 23 BCE, though the kingdom used a different calendar based on the movements of celestial spirits rather than solar cycles. The king's footsteps echoed softly against the smooth stone walls as he descended into the earth. Oil lamps flickered in, niches carved at regular intervals, their flames dancing in the slight breeze that always seemed to flow through these ancient passages. The air grew cooler and more still as he went deeper, carrying with it the faint scent of burning incense and something else, something that visitors often described as the smell of starlight, though none could explain what that meant. Waiting for him in the chamber was the high shaman Miriok, an elderly woman whose age was a matter of speculation rather than record. Some claimed she had served Jameson's grandfather. Others whispered that she was far older, possibly as ancient as the kingdom itself. Her white hair was bound with silver ornaments that chimed softly when she moved, and her eyes held the distant look of someone who spent more time in the spirit world than the physical one. The chamber of echoes was perfectly round, with a domed ceiling that amplified and transformed sound in mysterious ways. Words spoken in normal tones would return as whispers from unexpected directions, while whispers would sometimes boom like thunder. The shamans claimed this acoustic phenomenon was not architectural but spiritual. The chamber was where the voices of gods and ancestors could be heard most clearly. Miriok had requested this urgent meeting because of dreams that had plagued her for 7 nights. In shamanic tradition, dreams that repeated for 7 consecutive nights were not mere visions, but prophecies that demanded immediate attention. She had seen images that filled her with both wonder and dread. The kingdom's protective spirits departing like birds before a storm. The throne of whispered stones cracking down its center. And most disturbing of all, King Daemon walking alone through an empty palace, calling out to gods who no longer answered. "My lord," Miriok began, her voice carrying the formal cadence reserved for sacred communications. "The spirits grow restless. The mountain gods whisper of changes coming from the east, changes that will shake the foundations of all kingdoms, both seen and unseen." Daemon settled, cross-legged on a woven mat, his own breathing slowing to match the rhythm of the chambers. Subtle vibrations. Unlike many rulers of his time, he had been trained from childhood in shamanic practices and could enter meditative states that allowed him to perceive beyond ordinary human limitations. The crown he wore was not gold or silver, but carved jade and polished obsidian, materials chosen for their spiritual properties rather than their monetary value. The prophecy that Miriok shared that morning would become the pivot point around which the kingdom's fate would turn. She spoke of a time when the old ways would be challenged by new ideas from distant lands, when the harmony between human and divine would be tested by those who sought to remake the world according to purely human designs. She described armies that fought not just with swords and spears, but with ideas that could shatter belief systems and replace ancient wisdom with foreign concepts. But the most cryptic part of her vision concerned the throne itself. She had seen it speaking not through the king who sat upon it, but with its own voice, warning of a choice that would adapt to new realities and risk losing its divine connection forever. What makes this prophecy particularly intriguing from a historical perspective is that similar warnings appear in shamanic traditions throughout East Asia during this period. Chinese records speak of spirit speakers who predicted the end of the old ways, a phenomenon, or a shared understanding among mystics that fundamental changes were coming to their world. The meeting in the Chamber of Echoes lasted from dawn until the sun reached its peak. During this time, other shamans and advisors joined the king and Miriok, each adding their own insights and interpretations to the unfolding prophecy. Master Ginsing, the keeper of the kingdom's genealogical records, noted that the royal bloodline had produced 7 generations of priest-kings, and 7 was considered a number of completion in their mystical system. The royal astronomer, a thin man named Byorgi, who spent his nights on the palace's highest tower mapping the movements of stars and planets, contributed observations about celestial alignments that seemed to support Miriok's visions. He had noticed that certain constellations were shifting in ways that ancient texts described as omens of great transformation. Most intriguingly, the court historian, an elderly scholar named Gikiel, who maintained the kingdom's official records, revealed that he had discovered gaps in the historical accounts that suggested similar periods of upheaval in the distant past. These gaps were not random, but appeared to occur in cycles, as if the kingdom periodically faced challenges that threatened its very existence. As the discussion continued, a pattern emerged that would become central to understanding what happened to the kingdom. The advisors realized that they were not facing a simple political or military threat, but something far more complex, a challenge to the fundamental assumptions about reality that their entire civilization was built upon. The kingdom's power had always derived from its unique position as a bridge between worlds. Its rulers were not just political leaders, but spiritual intermediaries who maintained the delicate balance between human needs and divine will. Their laws were not arbitrary, human constructs, but attempts to reflect cosmic principles in earthly governance. Their military strength came not from superior weapons or tactics, but from the protection of mountain spirits and ancestral guardians. Now, according to the prophecy, this entire worldview was under threat. New kingdoms were rising in the east, and west kingdoms that derived their power from purely human sources, organized armies, efficient bureaucracies, and economic systems that reduced everything to measurable, tradable commodities. These new powers saw the spiritual realm not as a source of wisdom and guidance, but as superstition to be overcome or manipulated. The prophecy suggested that the kingdom would soon face a choice that no previous generation had confronted: how to preserve its essential nature while adapting to a world that no longer recognized the validity of that nature. It was a dilemma that went to the heart of what it meant to be human. Are we purely physical beings whose spirituality is merely psychological? Or are we spiritual beings whose physical existence is just one aspect of a larger cosmic reality? King Damoson's response to this prophecy reveals much about his character and the nature of his rule. Rather than dismissing the visions as mere superstition or panicking about impending doom, he chose to approach the situation with the same methodical spirituality that characterized all his decisions. He announced that he would undertake a pilgrimage to the 7 sacred peaks, consulting with the mountain spirits and ancestral guardians before making any major decisions about the kingdom's future. This pilgrimage would take 49 days, 7 times 7, another mystically significant number. During this time, the kingdom would be governed by a council of shamans and advisors, following established protocols for periods when the king was engaged in spiritual communion. The throne of whispered stones would remain empty, waiting for his return and the wisdom he would bring back from the sacred mountains. As this chapter of our story draws to a close, let your mind drift with the king as he prepares for his journey into the high places where earth meets sky. Imagine the weight of responsibility he carried, knowing that the decisions he made in the coming weeks would determine not just his own fate, but the survival of an entire way of life. The mountain paths he would walk had been traveled by shamans and mystics for countless generations. Each step would take him further from the everyday world and deeper into the realm, where human consciousness touches something larger than itself. It was a journey that many had attempted, but few had completed with their sanity intact. The 7 sacred peaks. The autumn wind carried the scent of pine needles and wood, smoke as King Damoson began his ascent of the first sacred peak. He traveled alone, as tradition demanded, carrying only a small pack with basic supplies and the ceremonial staff that had been passed down through 7 generations of priest kings. The staff was carved from a single piece of mountain ash and topped with a sphere of clear quartz that was said to glow with inner light during moments of divine revelation. The 7 sacred peaks were arranged in a rough circle around the kingdom's heartland, each one associated with a different aspect of cosmic harmony. Scholarly analysis of surviving geographical descriptions suggests these peaks were located in what is now the Taebaek mountain range. though their exact identification remains a matter of speculation among historians and archaeologists. The first peak, known as Chiande, or Heaven's Platform, was the lowest of the seven, but considered the most important for beginning any spiritual journey. Ancient texts describe it as a place where the boundary between earth and sky was thinnest, where mortals could first learn to perceive the subtle energies that flowed between the physical and spiritual realms. As Jameson climbed the winding path that spiraled around the mountain's base, he followed rituals that had been preserved for centuries. Every 100 steps, he would pause to burn a pinch of sacred herbs and offer prayers to the mountain spirits. Every 1,000 steps, he would stop for meditation, allowing his consciousness to gradually shift from everyday awareness to the heightened sensitivity needed for spiritual communication. The path itself was remarkable from both engineering and mystical perspectives. Rather than taking the most direct route to the summit, it followed the mountain's natural energy lines, curves and switchbacks that seemed random to casual observers, but followed patterns that shamanic tradition claimed were revealed through divine inspiration. Modern geologists studying the region have noted that these ancient paths often follow geological features like underground streams and mineral veins, suggesting either remarkable intuitive understanding of mountain ecology or guidance from sources beyond ordinary human knowledge. Along the way, Jameson encountered the traditional markers that helped pilgrims track their spiritual as well as physical progress. Stone cairns marked places where previous travelers had experienced visions or received divine messages. Natural caves served as overnight shelters, their walls decorated with paintings and carvings that depicted encounters between humans and spiritual entities. Springs of clear speaking stones, large boulders that had been shaped by wind and weather into forms that resembled faces or figures. Shamanic tradition held that these stones could communicate with properly prepared individuals, offering guidance, warnings, or simply acknowledgement of the seeker's sincere intentions. Skeptical modern minds might dismiss this as pareidolia, the tendency to see meaningful patterns in random shapes, but the consistency of the messages on Chiande was spent in the cave of first listening, a natural chamber about halfway up the mountain where the acoustic properties created an effect similar to the chamber of echoes in his palace. As he settled into meditation, following breathing techniques that had been passed down through his royal lineage, he began to perceive sounds that were not quite sounds, vibrations that seemed to resonate more in his consciousness than in his ears. The experience of that first night set the pattern for the entire pilgrimage. Rather than receiving clear, unambiguous messages, Jameson encountered what he would later describe as whispers at the edge of understanding. Impressions and intuitions that required careful interpretation and integration with his existing knowledge and wisdom. What emerged from his communion with the spirit of Chiande was a sense of profound change, approaching not just his kingdom, but the entire world. The mountain spirits seemed to be grieving for something that had not yet been lost, but inevitably would be. The age of direct communication between humans and the divine realm was drawing to a close, not because the gods were abandoning humanity, but because humanity was choosing to close its ears to divine guidance. The second peak, Yongmori or Dragon's Head, presented entirely different challenges. Where Chiande had been a place of gentle introduction to spiritual awareness, Yongmori demanded confrontation with the darker aspects of cosmic reality. The mountain was shrouded in mists that seemed to move independently of wind patterns, and the path was treacherous, requiring not just physical stamina but unwavering mental focus. It was on Yongmori that Jameson encountered what shamanic texts referred to as the guardian of difficult truths, a spiritual entity that tested pilgrims' readiness to receive knowledge that might challenge their fundamental assumptions about reality. This guardian took no visible form, but manifested as a presence that filled the seeker with doubt, fear, and the temptation to abandon the quest and return to the comfortable certainties of ordinary life. The test that Jameson faced on the second peak involved confronting the possibility that everything he believed about his divine mandate to rule might be illusion. What if the voices he heard from the throne of whispered stones were not divine guidance, but elaborate self-deception? What if the kingdom's spiritual practices were merely sophisticated superstitions that would crumble when exposed to more rational ways of understanding the world? For 3 days and nights, the king wrestled with these doubts, neither eating nor sleeping, as he struggled to maintain his sense of purpose and identity. Historical accounts suggest that many pilgrims failed this test, either turning back in despair or continuing their journey in a state of spiritual paralysis that made the remaining peaks impossible to navigate successfully. Jameson's breakthrough came when he realized that the test was not about eliminating doubt, but about learning to hold certainty and uncertainty in dynamic balance. True wisdom, the guardian seemed to be suggesting, required the ability to act decisively based on one's best understanding, while remaining open to the possibility that this understanding might be incomplete or incorrect. The third peak, Dalbit, or moonlight, was associated with the feminine principles of receptivity, intuition, and the subtle energies that flowed beneath the surface of apparent reality. Here, Jameson's challenge was to set aside the masculine tendency toward active problem-solving and allow solutions to emerge from deeper levels of consciousness. The shamanic texts describe this peak as a place where the boundary between dreaming and waking consciousness became fluid. Pilgrims would often lose track of time, experiencing visions that lasted subjective hours or days, while only minutes passed in the physical world. Or, conversely, brief glimpses of insight that required hours of integration and understanding. On Dalbit, Jameson experienced what he would later describe as the great viewing of vision of his kingdom and its place in the larger patterns of historical change. He saw the rise and fall of civilizations as part of vast cycles that operated according to principles beyond human comprehension. Kingdoms that seemed permanent and powerful were revealed as brief experiments in the cosmic laboratory of consciousness evolution. More specifically, he saw that his own kingdom represented an attempt to maintain harmony between spiritual and material development. During a time when most human societies were choosing to emphasize one at the expense of the other, the challenge was not to prevent change, but to find ways of preserving essential wisdom while adapting to new circumstances. The fourth peak, Baramu Ijip, or House of Winds, tested the pilgrim's ability to remain centered while being buffered by forces beyond their control. The mountain was notorious for sudden weather changes, and the path included sections where travelers had to navigate narrow ledges while fierce winds threatened to blow them into the void. Metaphorically, this peak represented the challenge of maintaining spiritual equilibrium while external circumstances shifted unpredictably. Jameson spent 2 days on Baramu Ijip, learning to find stillness within movement, to make decisions while information remained incomplete, and to trust in guidance that came not from rational analysis, but from deeper sources of knowing. As we follow the king on his mystical journey through the sacred mountains, let your own consciousness drift like mountain mist through these ancient landscapes. Imagine the sound of wind through pine branches, the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot, the distant cry of eagles circling high overhead. Feel the thin air of high altitude, the way physical exertion strips away mental complexity and reveals simpler, more fundamental truths about existence. The pilgrimage was transforming Damascene in ways that would prove crucial for the challenges awaiting his kingdom. Each peak was teaching him different aspects of the wisdom he would need to navigate the coming crisis, preparing him for decisions that would determine whether the ancient ways could survive in a rapidly changing world. Chapter 4. Visions of the Ancient Throne. The fifth peak, Jungshim, or Center Heart, stood at the geographical center of the seven sacred mountains, and according to shamanic tradition, it was here that the deepest mysteries were revealed to worthy pilgrims. The approach to this mountain was different from the others. Instead of a single winding path, there were 7 different routes, each beginning from the base of one of the other peaks, converging at a circular plateau about 2/3 of the way to the summit. King Damascene had spent nearly 3 weeks in the mountains by the time he reached this convergence point, and the physical and spiritual disciplines of the pilgrimage had altered his consciousness in profound ways. His perception had become heightened to the point where he could sense the subtle energy patterns that flowed through the landscape, and his dreams had begun to blend seamlessly with his waking experiences. At the center of the plateau stood a circle of standing stones that appeared to be naturally formed, but arranged with such geometric precision that their origin remained a mystery. Each stone was roughly twice the height of a man and carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change depending on the observer's angle and state of mind. These were the stones of all directions, and they served as both a navigation aid for pilgrims and a focal point for the mountain's spiritual energies. It was here, in the shadow of these ancient monoliths, that Damascene experienced the vision that would change everything. As he settled into the deep, meditative state that had become second nature during his journey, his consciousness seemed to expand beyond the boundaries of his individual identity and merge with something vast and timeless. In this expanded state, he became aware of the true history of the throne of whispered stones. What he had always believed to be a single artifact created by human craftsmen was revealed to be something far more complex and mysterious. The throne was not made, but grown, formed over centuries by the interaction between human consciousness and the living spirit of the mountain itself. The vision showed him the kingdom's first priest-king, a figure whose name had been lost to history, but whose presence Damascene could feel as clearly as if they were sitting side by side. This ancient ruler had not discovered the throne, but had participated in its creation through decades of meditation and spiritual practice. The black jade of which it was carved had originally been ordinary stone, transformed through continuous exposure to focused spiritual energy. More remarkably, the vision revealed that the throne was not unique. Throughout history, in cultures around the world, similar artifacts had been created through the same process of spiritual material synthesis. Each of these objects served as an anchor point between the physical and spiritual realms, allowing advanced practitioners to access forms of knowledge and wisdom that transcended ordinary human limitations. But the vision also showed that these anchor points were becoming unstable. The changing consciousness of humanity, the shift toward more materialistic and rationalistic ways of understanding reality, was disrupting the delicate balance that allowed such objects to function like tuning forks that could no longer resonate. Because the surrounding environment had changed, the mystical artifacts were losing their connection to the spiritual realm. In his expanded awareness, Damascene could perceive this process happening not just to his own throne, but to sacred objects throughout the world. In distant Egypt, the mystical properties of certain pyramids were fading. In the high mountains of Tibet, prayer wheels that had once generated visible auras of light were becoming merely decorative in the sacred groves of what would someday be called Europe. Standing stones that had once hummed with earth energy were falling silent. The vision continued to unfold, showing him scenes from the future that filled him with both wonder and sorrow. He saw great cities rising where forests once stood, their lights blotting out the stars that had guided shamans and mystics for millennia. He witnessed the development of technologies that could accomplish through mechanical means what had once required spiritual discipline and divine connection. But perhaps most troubling of all, he saw the gradual forgetting that would overtake humanity. Not just the loss of specific knowledge or techniques, but the forgetting of entire categories of reality. Future humans would live in a world where the spiritual realm was considered either non-existent or irrelevant, where consciousness was reduced to brain chemistry, and where the idea of direct communication with divine intelligences would be dismissed as primitive superstition. Yet the vision was not entirely bleak. Damascene also perceived that this forgetting was not permanent, but cyclical. Humanity would rediscover its spiritual capacities, though perhaps in forms very different from the traditions he knew. The challenge for his generation was to preserve essential wisdom in ways that could survive the coming dark age and serve as seeds for future spiritual renaissance. As the vision deepened, he found himself standing in the throne room of his palace. But it was a throne room transformed. The throne of whispered stones pulsed with an inner light that illuminated symbols carved into the walls. Symbols that had always been there, but had never been visible to ordinary sight. The 5 standing stones that surrounded the throne were revealed to be more than decorative elements. They were components of a sophisticated system for focusing and amplifying consciousness. The throne itself began to speak, not with the familiar voice that had guided 7 generations of priest-kings, but with a deeper, more ancient tone that seemed to come from the mountain itself. It explained that the kingdom stood at a crossroads, not just politically, but spiritually. The old ways of direct divine communication were ending, but new possibilities were emerging for those wise enough to recognize and develop them. The throne revealed that it had been preparing for this transition for centuries, gradually shifting its function from active guidance to passive preservation. Instead of continuing to speak with the voices of gods and ancestors, it would become a repository of compressed spiritual knowledge, waiting for a time when humanity would be ready to receive such teachings again. But this transformation required a conscious choice and active participation from the current priest-king. Damascene would have to decide whether to maintain the throne's current function and risk its destruction by the changing spiritual climate, or to participate in its transformation and ensure its survival for future generations, even if that meant the end of his own kingdom as a political entity. The vision showed him both possibilities. In one timeline, he chose to preserve the old ways unchanged. The kingdom maintained its spiritual practices and divine connections for several more generations, but eventually succumbed to pressure from more materialistic neighbors. The throne was destroyed or lost, and its accumulated wisdom was scattered to the winds. In the other timeline, he chose to participate in the transformation. The kingdom would be deliberately dissolved, its population dispersed to carry fragments of its wisdom to other lands. The throne would be hidden in such a way that it could be rediscovered when the spiritual climate changed again. The immediate result would be the end of everything he had known and loved. But the ultimate outcome would be the preservation and eventual restoration of humanity's connection to the divine realm. As the vision began to fade, Damascene found himself back on the mountain plateau, but profoundly changed by what he had experienced. The weight of the choice he would have to make settled on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. The remaining 2 peaks of his pilgrimage would prepare him for the practical aspects of implementing whichever decision he made. But the fundamental question had already been posed with crystal clarity. The sun was setting behind the mountains as he prepared for his final night on Zhengxin, and the standing stones cast long shadows across the plateau. In the gathering darkness, he could hear the distant sounds of the kingdom below, the evening calls of shepherds bringing their flocks home, the bells of temples marking the end of the day, the laughter of children playing in village squares. All of this might soon be memory, preserved only in the compressed wisdom of a transformed throne waiting in hidden darkness for a future generation to rediscover. The burden of such knowledge was almost overwhelming, but it was tempered by a deep sense of purpose and connection to something larger than individual will or desire. The Council of Spirits, the 6th peak, Yongganyu, Idap, or Tower of Souls, rose like a stone needle against the morning sky as king. Dameson began his approach to the most challenging section of his pilgrimage. This mountain was different from the others, where they had been clothed in forests and gentle slopes. Yongganyu Idap was stark and forbidding, its granite faces rising almost vertically from the surrounding landscape. According to shamanic tradition, this peak was where the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of ancestors became most permeable. Pilgrims who reached its summit were said to be able to communicate directly with the spirits of all who had gone before, receiving counsel from the accumulated wisdom of generations past. The path up the mountain was more like a pilgrimage in itself, marked by shrines and memorials to shamans, kings, and holy men who had made this same journey over the centuries. At each shrine, Dameson paused to burn incense and offer prayers, following protocols that had been established so long ago that their origins were lost in the mists of time. As he climbed higher, the air grew thin and cold, and his breath formed clouds that seemed to linger longer than natural physics would suggest. The mountain played tricks with sound as well. Sometimes his footsteps would echo with unusual resonance, and occasionally he would hear what sounded like distant voices speaking in languages he couldn't identify. About halfway up the mountain, he reached the terrace of preparation, a flat area carved into the cliff face where pilgrims traditionally spent at least one full day and night preparing for the final ascent. Here, ancient stone seats were arranged in a semicircle facing toward the summit, and the walls of the surrounding cliff were covered with inscriptions left by previous visitors. Some of these inscriptions were in the Korean script of his time, others in Chinese characters, and still others in symbols that appeared to be much older, possibly predating any known writing system in the region. Modern scholars who have studied similar sites suggest that these might represent an indigenous shamanic notation system that was used to record spiritual experiences that couldn't be adequately expressed in conventional language. During his night on the terrace of preparation, Dameson experienced the first direct contact with the spirits that would guide him through the Council of Souls awaiting him at the summit. These were not the mountain spirits he had communed with on the earlier peaks, but the actual presence of individuals who had once lived as he now lived, faced similar challenges, and passed on to whatever existence awaited beyond physical death. The first spirit to manifest was his own great-grandfather, the 4th priest king of the dynasty, who had died when Dameson was still a child. The old king's presence was unmistakable, the same mixture of authority and gentleness that Dameson remembered from his earliest years, but now expanded and refined by whatever wisdom comes from the perspective of the afterlife. "Grandson," the spirit spoke, though whether the words were heard with his ears or perceived directly by his consciousness was impossible to determine. You carry a burden that no previous king of our line has faced, but shall last for centuries. The key insight that the Council of Spirits shared was that these cycles were not random, but served a purpose in the overall evolution of human consciousness. Each period of spiritual connection was followed by a time of apparent disconnection that actually served to integrate the lessons learned and prepared the ground for the next phase of development. During the periods of spiritual darkness, the divine wisdom didn't disappear, but went underground, preserved in hidden forms that could survive the hostile environment. Mystery schools, secret societies, and esoteric traditions, the path became a series of handholds carved into the rock face, requiring him to climb almost vertically for the last 1,000 feet. The exposure was terrifying. A single mistake would mean a fall that would certainly be fatal, but the spiritual disciplines he had practiced throughout his life allowed him to remain focused and calm despite the physical danger at the summit. He found a small circular platform that was completely natural in formation, but so perfectly level and round that it seemed to have been crafted by divine architects. At the center of this platform sat a simple stone chair, worn smooth by centuries of use, facing east toward the rising sun. As he settled into the chair and entered the deep, meditative state that would allow him to access the Council of Spirits at their highest level of manifestation, Jameson felt the weight of history settling around him like a vast, invisible presence. Every decision that had ever been made by a spiritual leader facing similar circumstances seemed to echo in the thin mountain air. The council that manifested at the summit was far more extensive than the gathering he had experienced on the terrace. Spirits from throughout history appeared, not just from his own culture and time, but from civilizations around the world and across the millennia. Egyptian priests who had overseen the closing of ancient temples, Tibetan monks who had hidden sacred texts from invading armies, Celtic druids who had transformed their knowledge into story and song to preserve it through the Dark Ages. Each of these spirits had faced the same fundamental choice: how to preserve spiritual wisdom during times when the world was no longer receptive to such knowledge. Their accumulated experience formed a vast library of strategies, successes, and failures that Jameson could draw upon in making his own decision. What became clear through hours of communion with these ancient souls was that there was no single correct answer to his dilemma. The choice had to be made based on the specific circumstances of his time and place, taking into account the unique characteristics of the knowledge to be preserved and the particular challenges of the approaching Dark Age. Some traditions had preserved their wisdom by going completely underground, maintaining their practices in secret while appearing to conform to the dominant culture. Others had chosen to embed their knowledge in seemingly secular forms: art, literature, architecture, and music that carried encoded spiritual teachings. Still others had scattered their wisdom widely, trusting that fragments would survive in folklore, customs, and half-remembered traditions that might someday be pieced back together. The council revealed that his own kingdom represented a particularly pure form of the shamanic tradition that had once been common throughout East Asia. The knowledge preserved in the throne of whispered stones included not just the accumulated wisdom of his own ancestors, but fragments of much older traditions that had been integrated and refined over centuries of practice. This made the decision even more weighty. If the throne were lost or destroyed, it would mean the disappearance of irreplaceable knowledge that could not be reconstructed from other sources. But if it were preserved through the transformation he had witnessed in his vision, there was a chance that this ancient wisdom could be rediscovered and developed further when conditions became favorable again. As the day wore on, and the Council of Spirits continued to share their insights and experiences, a consensus began to emerge. The approaching age of materialism would be longer and more thorough than previous cycles of spiritual darkness. The methods that had worked to preserve knowledge through earlier transitions would not be sufficient for what was coming. More radical measures would be required. Measures that would seem like destruction to those who loved the old ways, but were actually the most effective form of preservation possible under the circumstances. The kingdom would have to be voluntarily dissolved, its people scattered to carry fragments of its wisdom to other lands, and its most sacred objects hidden in ways that would protect them not just from physical destruction, but from the spiritual corrosion of an age that had lost faith in the reality of the divine realm. As the sun reached its zenith above the mountain peak, the Council of Spirits began to fade. The time had come to begin the great concealment, the deliberate hiding of spiritual treasures until the wheel of time brought humanity back to a point where it could receive them again. The weight of this decision was almost crushing, but it was balanced by a profound sense of purpose and connection to something larger than individual will or desire. Jameson was not acting alone, but as part of an ancient tradition of guardians who had preserved humanity's spiritual heritage through countless cycles of forgetting and remembering. The seventh summit and the seventh and final peak of Jameson's pilgrimage was known as Geoldanson, the Mountain of Decision, and unlike the others, it could only be approached after completing the circuit of the first six. The path to its base began at the summit of Yongjinu Idap and followed a ridgeline that was invisible from below, threading between the other peaks in a spiral pattern that gradually descended toward the central valley where the seventh mountain rose. This hidden approach was itself a form of spiritual teaching. Only those who had gained the perspective available from the sixth summit could perceive the correct path, and only those who had absorbed the lessons of all six previous peaks would have the wisdom necessary to navigate the final challenge. As Jameson made his way along the ridge path, he carried with him not just the physical exhaustion of nearly 6 weeks in the mountains, but the accumulated weight of all the knowledge and responsibility that had been placed upon him. The seeds of wisdom given to him by the Geodanson took him through landscapes that seemed to exist outside normal time and space. Valleys where the seasons appeared to change with each step. Forests where the trees grew in geometric patterns that hurt the eyes to look at directly. Streams that flowed uphill, and pools that reflected not the sky above, but scenes from distant places and times. These phenomena were not hallucinations brought on by exhaustion and fasting, but manifestations of the mountain's unique position at the convergence of multiple energy lines that crisscrossed the Korean peninsula. Modern geological surveys have identified unusual magnetic anomalies in this region, and some researchers have speculated that the area sits above a complex network of underground mineral formations that could theoretically create electromagnetic effects on human consciousness. At the base of the seventh mountain, Jameson encountered the final test of his pilgrimage, a guardian that was neither spirit nor human, but something that seemed to embody the principle of choice itself. This entity manifested as a constantly shifting form that appeared sometimes as an ancient sage, sometimes as a fierce warrior, sometimes as a beautiful woman, and sometimes as abstract patterns of light and shadow that conveyed meaning without taking recognizable shape. The guardian spoke in a voice that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, its words carrying harmonics that resonated not just in his ears, but throughout his entire body. King of the forgotten realm, it said. You have journeyed far to reach this place, but the greatest distance still lies before you. The summit of this mountain can only be reached by those who are willing to leave behind everything they have been in order to become what they must be. This was the test of ultimate surrender, the willingness to release attachment, not just to personal desires and fears, but to identity itself. To reach the summit of Gildanson, Damascene would have to let go of his sense of himself as a king, as a member of a particular dynasty, even as a human being with a specific history and set of relationships experienced on the previous peaks. Instead of expanding his consciousness to encompass more and more of reality, he had to contract it down to a single point of pure awareness, a point that was simultaneously infinitely small and infinitely large, containing nothing and everything. At the same time as he began the final ascent, climbing not with his physical body but with this refined essence of consciousness, the mountain revealed its true nature. Gildanson was not made of ordinary rock and earth, but was itself a kind of crystallized decision, the accumulated choices of every seeker who had ever faced the fundamental question of how to serve the greater good when personal desires pointed in a different direction. Each step upward required him to make and remake the choice to continue, to reaffirm his commitment to wisdom over comfort, service over self-interest, long-term benefit over short-term gratification. The mountain tested his resolve at every level, showing him tempting alternatives that would allow him to preserve his kingdom, his power, and his personal happiness at the cost of failing in his cosmic responsibility. Halfway up the mountain, he encountered a vision of himself returning to his palace and simply continuing to rule as his ancestors had done, ignoring the prophecies and visions as mere superstition. In this alternative timeline, the kingdom prospered for several more generations. The people remained happy and prosperous, and he was remembered as a wise and successful ruler. But the vision also showed him the ultimate consequences of this choice. When the inevitable changes finally came, they swept away not just his kingdom, but every trace of the wisdom it had preserved. The throne of whispered stones was broken up and used to build ordinary walls, its accumulated knowledge lost forever. The shamanic traditions were forgotten, the sacred sites were desecrated, and humanity's connection to the divine realm was severed so completely that it took millennia to re-establish even the faintest echo of what had been lost. Higher up the mountain, he encountered another alternative, fleeing with the throne and a small group of followers to some distant land where the old ways might be preserved unchanged. This vision showed him establishing a hidden community that maintained the traditional practices for many generations, becoming a legend whispered about in various cultures as a mystical kingdom that appeared and disappeared according to its own mysterious laws. This alternative was more off from the larger currents of human development. The hidden kingdom became increasingly irrelevant, its knowledge increasingly abstract and divorced from the real challenges facing humanity's spiritual evolution near the summit. The final and most seductive alternative presented itself. He could use the power of the throne to actively resist the coming changes, rallying other spiritual traditions to fight against the rising tide of materialism. The vision showed him leading a great alliance of shamans, mystics, and priest-kings in a supernatural war against the forces of spiritual darkness. This alternative appealed to his warrior nature and his deep love for the traditions he had been raised to protect. But the mountain's wisdom helped him see that such a war, even if successful, would ultimately corrupt the very things it sought to preserve. Spiritual power used for conquest, even conquest in service of spiritual goals. inevitably becomes worldly power, subject to the same limitations and corruptions as any other form of dominance. At the summit of Geodanson, Dameson found not another test or challenge, but a simple, natural clearing where the mountain's peak flattened into a small meadow filled with flowers that bloomed in impossible profusion despite the altitude and the approaching winter. At the center of the meadow stood a single tree, ancient beyond measure, its trunk so large that it would take dozens of people holding hands to encircle it, its branches reaching so high that its crown was lost in clouds. This was the tree of all choices, and according to the shamanic traditions, it was here that the fundamental decisions that shaped the destiny of nations and civilizations were made, not by individual will or desire, but by consciousness that had been refined to the point where it could perceive and align itself with the deepest currents of cosmic intention. As Dameson approached the tree, he felt the last vestiges of his personal identity dissolving away. He was no longer a king making a political decision, or even a man facing a moral dilemma. He had become a transparent channel through which the wisdom of the universe could express itself in response to the specific challenges of his time and place. The tree spoke to him without words, its communication taking the form of direct knowledge that appeared in his consciousness like memories of experiences he had never had. Through this communion, he understood with perfect clarity what needed to be done and why, though the knowledge came with the understanding that he would not be able to explain or justify it to others using ordinary, rational discourse. The decision that emerged from this final communion was both shocking in its implications and inevitable in its logic. The kingdom would indeed be dissolved, but not through conquest or gradual decay. Instead, it would be deliberately transformed in a great ritual that would scatter its people and treasures throughout the known world while simultaneously concealing its most precious wisdom in forms that could survive the coming dark age. The throne of whispered stones would be dismantled and its components hidden in 7 different locations, each guarded by a lineage of protectors who would pass down their responsibility through generations of descendants. The throne could only be reassembled when representatives of all 7 lineages came together with the proper knowledge and pure intention, something that might not happen for centuries or millennia. The kingdom's people would be given a choice. They could remain in the ancestral lands and gradually lose their connection to the spiritual traditions as the old ways became increasingly difficult to maintain. Or they could accept exile and carry fragments of the kingdom's wisdom to distant lands where it might take root in new forms adapted to different cultures and circumstances. Most remarkably, the decision included provisions for ensuring that the story of what had happened would be preserved, but in forms so transformed that future generations would debate whether the kingdom had ever existed at all. This would protect the hidden wisdom from those who might seek to exploit or corrupt it, while keeping alive the possibility that genuine seekers might eventually piece together enough clues to begin the work of restoration. As the full implications of this decision settled into his consciousness, Dameson felt simultaneously devastated and exhilarated. Everything he had known and loved would end, but its essence would be preserved and potentially renewed in ways that might surpass even the glory of the original. He was being asked to participate in an act of destruction that was actually the ultimate creative act, the planting of seeds that might not flower for millennia. The sun was setting as he began his descent from the mountain of decision, carrying with him not just a plan of action, but a transformed understanding of what it meant to serve something larger than individual will or desire. The hardest part of his journey was over, but the most difficult work still lay ahead. The Great Concealment begins. King Dameson returned to his palace after 49 days in the sacred mountains to find a kingdom that seemed unchanged on the surface but hummed with subtle tension beneath its placid exterior. The autumn harvest had been completed in his absence. The festivals had been celebrated according to ancient custom, and the daily rituals that maintained harmony between the human and divine realms had continued under the guidance of the shamanic council, yet those with sensitivity to spiritual currents could perceive that something fundamental had shifted. The very air seemed charged with anticipation, as if the kingdom itself was holding its breath before some momentous transformation. Animals behaved strangely, birds gathering in unusual formations, horses becoming restless without apparent cause, and the palace cats spending their days staring intently at empty corners, as if watching invisible dramas unfold. The king's first act upon returning was to summon the inner circle of advisors who had been privy to the high shaman Miriok's prophecy. This group included not only the shamanic and scholarly counselors who had attended the original meeting in the Chamber of Echoes, but also the master craftsmen, the keepers of the royal treasures, and the commanders of the temple guards who would be essential to implementing the plan that had crystallized during his mountain pilgrimage. The meeting took place in the deepest chamber of the palace complex, a room that had been carved from living bedrock and was accessed through a maze of tunnels that effectively made it impossible to approach without being detected. The chamber was circular, with walls that curved upward to form a dome, and its acoustic properties were such that whispers at the center could be heard clearly at any point along the circumference, while remaining inaudible to anyone standing outside the entrance. When the assembled advisors saw the king's face, illuminated by the soft light of oil lamps that burned with flames that never flickered in the still air of the deep chamber, they knew immediately that their world was about to change forever. The man who had left for the mountains 7 weeks earlier had been their familiar ruler, carrying the burdens and uncertainties that they had all shared. The man who had returned was still recognizably the same individual, but transformed by knowledge that set him apart from ordinary human concerns. "My faithful counselors," Dameson began, his voice carrying the same resonant quality that had characterized his words when he spoke from the throne of whispered stones. "I have seen what must come to pass, and I have accepted the burden of implementing changes that will be difficult beyond anything our people have ever faced." He proceeded to describe, in carefully measured phrases, the visions he had received and the decision that had emerged from his communion with the tree of all choices. As he spoke, the assembled advisors experienced a range of reactions that reflected their different temperaments and levels of spiritual understanding. Master craftsman Giancio, whose family had maintained the palace and its sacred objects for 6 generations, was the first to grasp the practical implications of what the king was proposing. "My lord," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "you are asking us to deliberately destroy everything our ancestors built, everything we have spent our lives protecting and preserving." "No," Dameson replied with gentle firmness, "I am asking you to transform it in ways that will ensure its preservation through times when direct protection would be impossible. The choice is not between preservation and destruction, but between transformation and loss." High Shaman Miriok, whose prophecy had initiated this entire chain of events, nodded slowly as she absorbed the king's words. Her decades of experience in navigating the boundary between the visible and invisible worlds had prepared her to understand the cosmic perspective that now guided their rulers' thinking. "The signs have been clear for those with eyes to see," she acknowledged. The mountain Spirits have been withdrawing their direct participation in human affairs. The voices of the ancestors have grown fainter each season. Even the throne of whispered stones speaks now with less clarity than it did in my youth. Royal astronomer biology contributed observations that supported the king's assessment from a different angle. The celestial patterns have indeed been shifting toward configurations that our ancient texts associate with great endings and new beginnings. He confirmed the star formations that guided our ancestors are moving into alignments that will not recur for thousands of years. As the discussion continued through the night, a detailed plan began to emerge for what would become known in the scattered oral traditions as the Great Concealment. This was not simply a matter of hiding valuable objects or dispersing the population, but a carefully orchestrated transformation that would preserve the kingdom's essential wisdom while making it invisible to those who lacked the proper understanding and motivation to receive it. The first phase would involve the identification and training of the 7 guardian lineages, who would be responsible for protecting the components of the dismantled throne. These would not be randomly chosen families, but carefully selected bloodlines that had demonstrated both spiritual sensitivity and unshakable loyalty across multiple generations. Each lineage would receive one piece of the throne, along with specific knowledge about its care and preservation. But more importantly, they would be given fragments of the complete understanding that would be necessary to eventually reassemble the artifact and restore its function. No single lineage would possess enough knowledge to reconstruct the throne alone, ensuring that the restoration could only be accomplished through cooperation among all 7 families. The selection process for these guardian lineages was itself a remarkable example of the kingdom's sophisticated understanding of human psychology and spiritual development. Rather than simply choosing the most prominent or wealthy families, the king and his advisors identified bloodlines that had consistently produced individuals with particular combinations of traits, not just spiritual sensitivity, but also the ability to maintain secrets across generations, the wisdom to recognize genuine seekers, and the strength to resist both corruption and persecution. Each chosen family was approached with great ceremony and careful explanation of what was being asked of them. They were given time to consider the magnitude of the responsibility and the right to decline if they felt unequal to the task. Remarkably, historical fragments suggest that all 7 lineages accepted their roles, though some required extensive discussion and preparation before making their final commitment. The second phase involved the careful documentation and encoding of the kingdom's accumulated knowledge. This was not simply a matter of copying existing texts, but of transforming oral traditions, ritual practices, and experiential wisdom into forms that could be preserved and transmitted by people who might not fully understand their significance. Master Scholar Gikiel led this effort, working with a team of scribes, artists, and craftsmen to create what would become one of the most sophisticated information preservation systems ever developed. The knowledge was encoded at multiple levels, some preserved in straightforward written form for future scholars, some embedded in artwork and architectural details that would seem merely decorative to casual observers, and some woven into stories, songs, and folk customs that would be carried by the dispersed population to their new homes. The most sensitive information was encoded using methods that required not just intellectual understanding, but spiritual development to decode. Meditation techniques were disguised as poetry. Ritual formulas were embedded in children's games, and complex philosophical concepts were expressed through the design of household objects that would seem perfectly ordinary to anyone who didn't possess the proper keys to their interpretation. The third phase was perhaps the most emotionally difficult, the preparation of the population for the dissolution of their homeland. This could not be presented as a defeat or disaster, which would have created the wrong psychological conditions for carrying the kingdom's wisdom to new locations. Instead, it had to be framed as a sacred mission that would spread their traditions throughout the known world and plant seeds for future. Spiritual Renaissance. The king began this process with a series of public ceremonies that gradually introduced the idea of voluntary exile as a form of pilgrimage. Rather than abandoning their homeland, the people were being asked to become missionaries, carrying precious gifts to distant lands that had been impoverished by their lack of connection to the divine realm. These ceremonies were carefully designed to evoke both sadness at what was being left behind and excitement about the adventures and opportunities that lay ahead. Master musicians composed songs that captured the bittersweet nature of the transition, while storytellers created tales of heroic ancestors who had undertaken similar journeys in the distant past. Most importantly, the ceremonies established spiritual frameworks that would help the exiles maintain their connection to the kingdom's traditions, even when they were no longer surrounded by the physical and social structures that had previously supported their practice. Portable shrines were created that could serve as focal points for meditation and ritual in any location. Prayer sequences were taught that could maintain spiritual discipline without requiring elaborate temple settings. Community practices were adapted to function with small groups scattered across vast distances. As winter approached and the time for implementing the Great Concealment drew near, the entire kingdom seemed to exist in a state of suspended animation. Daily life continued according to established patterns, but everyone was aware that these familiar routines would soon be nothing but memories. The poignancy of this situation created a heightened appreciation for simple pleasures and ordinary moments that might otherwise have been taken for granted. Children played with unusual intensity, as if trying to compress a lifetime of joy into the remaining weeks. Adults found themselves paying closer attention to the changing colors of autumn leaves, the sound of wind through the palace corridors, the taste of water from the sacred springs. Even the most mundane activities took on ceremonial significance as people tried to imprint every detail of their familiar world into memory. The kingdom was preparing not just for physical dispersal, but for psychological and spiritual transformation, on a scale that had perhaps never been attempted in human history. What they were undertaking was nothing less than the voluntary dissolution of a civilization in service of preserving its deepest wisdom for future generations who might not be born for centuries. The seven guardians, as the first snows began to dust the peaks of the sacred mountains. The ritual preparation of the seven guardian lineages reached its culmination. Each family had undergone months of intensive training, not only in the specific care and protection of their assigned throne component, but in the broader spiritual disciplines that would allow them to maintain their sacred responsibilities across generations of exile and concealment. The seven families chosen for this momentous task represented different aspects of the kingdom's spiritual and cultural heritage. The selection had been made not just on the basis of bloodline purity or political loyalty, but according to subtle criteria that took into account each family's particular spiritual gifts and their potential for adapting those gifts to the challenges of preservation in foreign lands. The first guardian lineage was the family of master craftsman Jian Seal, whose ancestors had built and maintained the palace complex for 6 generations. They were entrusted with the throne's foundation stone, a piece of black jade that formed the base of the seat and contained the deepest layers of accumulated spiritual energy. This family's gift was the ability to work with stone and metal in ways that enhanced rather than diminished their spiritual properties. And they would carry this knowledge to the southern kingdoms, where they would establish themselves as renowned artisans. Their assigned destination was the growing kingdom of Silla, where their skills would be welcomed and their traditions could be preserved within the context of Buddhist temple construction. The throne's foundation stone would be incorporated into the base of a monastery's main altar, hidden in plain sight as part of the sacred architecture while maintaining its essential function as a repository of compressed wisdom. The second guardian lineage was descended from royal astronomer Bialji, whose family had served as keepers of celestial knowledge for 7 generations. They received the throne's back panel, a curved piece of jade carved with astronomical symbols that served as a map of both physical and spiritual heavens. This family's role would be to preserve the kingdom's sophisticated understanding of the relationship between cosmic cycles and human spiritual development. They were assigned to travel to the Western Mountains, where they would establish themselves among the scattered communities of Taoist hermits and scholars. The throne's back panel would be disguised as an astronomical instrument, its true function known only to the family's designated keeper, while its presence would gradually influence the development of mathematical and spiritual studies in the region. The third guardian lineage came from the family of Master Healer Yakum, whose knowledge of medicinal herbs and spiritual healing practices was considered unmatched throughout the kingdom. They were given custody of the throne's left armrest, which contained encoded knowledge about the relationship between physical health and spiritual development. This piece was particularly important because it held the keys to understanding how spiritual practices could be maintained even when practitioners faced the physical stresses of exile and cultural displacement. This family would journey to the eastern coastal regions, where they would establish themselves as a lineage of traveling healers. The throne's armrest would be incorporated into a portable shrine that would accompany them on their rounds, allowing the encoded wisdom to gradually influence the development of healing practices throughout the region while remaining invisible to those who lacked the proper spiritual preparation. The fourth guardian lineage was chosen from among the temple musicians, whose understanding of sound and vibration as spiritual forces made them ideal protectors of the throne's right armrest. This component contained the accumulated knowledge of how vocal techniques, instrumental music, and natural sound environments could be used to induce states of consciousness that allowed direct communication with spiritual realms. Their destination was the Northern Territories, where shamanistic traditions were still strong but beginning to fragment under pressure from more organized religious systems. The musical guardian family would preserve their throne component by incorporating it into a set of ritual instruments, its presence gradually enriching the spiritual power of musical practices throughout the region. The fifth guardian lineage was selected from the scholars who had served as keepers of the kingdom's historical records and philosophical texts. They received the throne's headrest, which contained the distilled wisdom of 7 generations of priest-kings and their accumulated understanding of how to balance spiritual authority with political responsibility. This family would travel to the Chinese heartland, where they would establish themselves as a scholarly lineage, specializing in the preservation and interpretation of ancient texts. The throne's headrest would be disguised as a bookstand used in their private library, its influence gradually enriching the philosophical and spiritual understanding of students who came to study with them. The sixth guardian lineage was chosen from among the palace guards who had demonstrated not only physical courage but also spiritual discernment in their protection of the kingdom's sacred sites. They were entrusted with one of the two seat cushions, components that contained knowledge about how to maintain spiritual practices under conditions of persecution and concealment. Their assignment was to travel to the Japanese islands, where they would establish themselves as a warrior family devoted to the protection of sacred sites and the preservation of martial arts that incorporated spiritual as well as physical training. The throne cushion would be concealed within the foundation of their family dojo, its presence ensuring that their martial traditions would maintain their spiritual dimension across centuries of development. The seventh and final, guardian lineage, was perhaps the most mysterious, chosen from a family of shamans who specialized in communication with the spirits of the dead and the unborn. They received the second seat cushion, which contained knowledge about how to maintain connections with the kingdom's spiritual heritage, even across vast distances of time and space. This family's destination was kept secret even from the other guardians, known only to the king and the high shaman. Historical fragments suggest they may have traveled to regions that were then largely unknown, possibly as far as the lands that would later be called Tibet, or even beyond, carrying their precious burden to places where ancient shamanic traditions could provide a suitable environment for its long-term preservation. The preparation of each guardian lineage involved not just the transfer of specific knowledge and responsibilities, but a profound spiritual initiation that would ensure their dedication to their task across multiple generations. Each family underwent a ceremonial process that bound them not just to their assigned throne component, but to each other and to the larger purpose of eventual restoration. This binding was not merely psychological, but involved spiritual techniques that created what modern psychologists might recognize as a form of collective unconscious shared among all 7 families. Even when separated by vast distances and centuries of time, members of the guardian lineages would experience dreams, intuitions, and synchronicities that kept them subtly connected to each other and to their common purpose. The most remarkable aspect of this preparation was the way it balanced the need for absolute secrecy with the requirement that the knowledge be transmitted accurately across generations. Each family developed elaborate systems of coded communication that would allow them to recognize authentic members of the other lineages should they ever encounter them, while ensuring that outsiders could not penetrate their secrets, even if they gained access to the family's private documents or oral traditions. Children born into the guardian lineages would grow up learning what appeared to be family trades, cultural traditions, or scholarly specializations, unaware until their understanding. The revelation of their true purpose would come only when they had demonstrated the necessary combination of directions of the known world. Each family had been provided with resources sufficient to establish themselves in their new homes, connections that would help them integrate into their chosen communities, and detailed knowledge of the conditions they were likely to encounter. But perhaps most importantly, they carried with them an unshakable sense of purpose that would sustain them through the inevitable hardships of exile and the decades of patient waiting that would be required before their ultimate mission could be fulfilled. They were no longer simply families with particular skills or knowledge, but guardians of humanity's spiritual heritage, entrusted with treasures that might prove essential to the spiritual development of future civilizations. The throne that had served as the spiritual heart of their kingdom for 7 generations would soon be scattered to the winds, its components hidden in 7 different locations, protected by 7 different traditions, waiting for a time when the wheel of cosmic cycles would bring humanity back to a point where its accumulated wisdom could once again be openly received. And developed the final ceremony. The night of the winter solstice arrived, with an unusual stillness that seemed to envelop the entire kingdom in a cocoon of expectant silence. No wind stirred the bare branches of the palace gardens, no night birds called from the surrounding forests, and even the streams that normally chattered their way down from the sacred mountains flowed with a hushed murmur that was barely audible. In the profound quiet, King Damison stood in the throne room for what he knew would be the last time, surrounded by the complete inner circle of advisors, shamans, and guardian family representatives who would participate in the ceremony that would mark the end of one age and the beginning of another. The chamber had been prepared according to rituals that were so ancient their origins were lost in the mists of prehistory. Their purpose understood not through rational analysis, but through the accumulated wisdom of generations of spiritual practice. The throne of whispered stones sat in the center of the chamber, surrounded by the 5 standing stones that had always framed it. But tonight, the familiar configuration seemed to pulse with an energy that was both more intense and more poignant, and the air around it shimmered with barely visible currents that suggested the presence of spiritual forces gathering for protected its people, the divine intelligences who had guided its rulers, and the cosmic forces that governed the great cycles of spiritual development that encompassed all human civilizations. As her voice rose and fell in the ancient cadences that had been preserved for centuries through oral tradition, the witnesses began to perceive the presence of these invoked beings gathering in the chamber, not as visible forms, but as presences that could be felt as shifts in the quality of attention, changes in the emotional atmosphere, and subtle alterations in the way light and shadow played across the carved walls. The first phase of the ceremony involved the formal transfer of each throne component to its designated guardian lineage. This was not simply a matter of physical handover, but a complex spiritual process that would bind each family to their assigned piece, while simultaneously severing the connections that had held the throne together as a unified artifact for 7 generations. Master craftsman Jianxiu approached the throne first, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he placed them on the foundation stone that had anchored the seat since the kingdom's founding. As he spoke the words of acceptance that had been taught to him during months of preparation, witnesses reported seeing a thread of golden light extend from the stone to his heart, creating a connection that would be maintained across whatever distances and circumstances his exile might bring. One by one, each guardian representative completed their portion of the transfer ritual. Royal Astronomer Biology received the back panel with its celestial maps. Master Healer Yako accepted the left armrest with its encoded medical wisdom, and so forth through all 7 components. With each transfer, the throne seemed to grow, slightly dimmer, its accumulated spiritual energy being redistributed among the various pieces rather than lost entirely. The most emotionally difficult moment came when the throne's central cushion, the part that kings had actually sat upon for generations, was divided between the 6th and 7th guardian lineages. This required a ritual cutting that was performed not with physical tools, but through focused spiritual intention that allowed the cushion to separate along lines of natural spiritual division that had always existed but had never before been activated as the final component was transferred, and the throne stood empty and partially disassembled for the first time in centuries. King Damison began the 2nd phase of the ceremony, the Great Unbinding. This involved the systematic dissolution of the spiritual connections that had made the kingdom function as a unified entity, releasing the energies that had been held in collective focus so that they could be dispersed and carry the kingdom's influence to distant lands. The process was both liberation and death, creation and destruction occurring simultaneously in ways that challenged the witnesses' ability to comprehend what they were experiencing. As each spiritual bond was ceremonially severed, those present felt parts of their identity and understanding dissolving away, replaced by a lighter but more uncertain sense of individual responsibility and freedom. The unbinding began with the connections between the throne and the 5 standing stones that surrounded it. These stones had served as focal points for the kingdom's spiritual energy, channeling the influences of the 5 directions, north, south, east, west, and center, into a unified field that had protected and nurtured the entire population. As these connections were severed, each stone began to resonate with a different frequency, creating harmonics that seemed to encode the essential characteristics of their respective directional influences. Next came the dissolution of the spiritual bonds that connected the palace to the 7 sacred peaks. These bonds had allowed the king and his advisors to draw upon the wisdom and power associated with each mountain, creating a network of spiritual communication that had informed every major decision made by the kingdom's rulers. As these connections were severed, witnesses reported feeling a profound sense of spiritual isolation, as if they were suddenly cut off from sources of guidance and support that they had never fully appreciated while they remained available. The most complex part of the unbinding involved the release of the ancestral connections that had allowed each generation of rulers to access the accumulated wisdom of their predecessors. This was not simply a matter of severing existing bonds, but of transforming them into a form that could be preserved within the scattered components of the throne, while no longer requiring the physical presence of the royal bloodline to maintain their continuity. The process required King Damison to enter the deepest meditative state he had ever achieved, allowing his consciousness to merge temporarily with the accumulated presence of all previous priest-kings, while simultaneously releasing his claim to their exclusive guidance. In effect, he was democratizing the royal wisdom, making it potentially available to anyone who might eventually gain access to the reassembled throne, regardless of their bloodline or political status. As this transformation was completed, witnesses reported seeing the king's appearance change in subtle but unmistakable ways. The aura of spiritual authority that had always surrounded him became less concentrated but more broadly distributed, as if his personal power was being dissolved into a form that could be shared among all who had been touched by the kingdom's spiritual influence. The third phase of the ceremony involved the ritual preparation of the kingdom's population for their diaspora. This could not be accomplished through individual instruction. There were too many people and too little time, but required a form of collective spiritual transmission that would implant the necessary knowledge and motivation directly into the unconscious minds of everyone who had been born or raised within the kingdom's borders. This transmission was accomplished through a technique that combined elements of mass hypnosis, shamanic vision sharing, and what modern researchers might recognize as a form of morphic field generation. Using the remaining spiritual energy of the dissolving kingdom as an amplifier, the assembled shamans and advisors created a unified field of consciousness that could be accessed by anyone who was spiritually or emotionally connected to the kingdom's welfare. Through this field, each individual received personalized guidance about where they should go, what they should carry with them, and how they should establish themselves in their new homes. More importantly, they received the spiritual tools and psychological preparation that would allow them to maintain their connection to the kingdom's traditions, even when they were no longer surrounded by the physical and social structures that had previously supported their practice. The transmission also included more subtle programming that would be activated only under specific circumstances. If any individual ever encountered a genuine member of one of the guardian lineages, they would experience a form of recognition that went beyond ordinary memory or reasoning. If they ever found themselves in the presence of one of the scattered throne components, they would feel a sense of familiarity and reverence that would motivate them to protect and preserve the artifact even if they didn't consciously understand its significance. As dawn approached and the ceremony entered its final phase, the physical dismantling of the throne began. This was not destruction but careful disassembly, with each component being wrapped in specially prepared cloths that had been blessed with protective spells and imbued with substances that would help preserve the jade's spiritual properties. During the long period of concealment that lay ahead, the dismantling had to be completed before the sun rose, not for magical reasons, but because the ceremony's psychological effectiveness depended on maintaining the symbolic association between the kingdom's dissolution and the ending of night. The new day would bring the beginning of the great diaspora, and it was essential that this transition be experienced as a rebirth rather than simply an ending. As the final components were wrapped and prepared for transport, King Jameson spoke. The words that formally dissolved the kingdom as a political entity and released his subjects from their oaths of loyalty and obedience. This was perhaps the most difficult moment of the entire ceremony, requiring him to voluntarily surrender not just his power, but his identity as the focal point of his people's collective spiritual life. "My beloved subjects," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber despite being barely above a whisper. "The kingdom that your ancestors built and that we have shared is ending, but what it represented is not being lost. You carry within yourselves everything that was most precious about our way of life, and you have the opportunity to plant seeds of that wisdom throughout the world." The ceremony concluded with a final blessing that was addressed not to the assembled witnesses but to future generations, who might someday work to reassemble the scattered throne and restore the spiritual tradition it represented. This blessing took the form of a complex musical composition that encoded specific information about the locations where the throne components would be hidden, the signs by which the guardian lineages could be identified, and the conditions that would indicate when the time for restoration had arrived. As the sun rose over the sacred mountains for the last time on the unified kingdom, the witnesses began to disperse to their assigned destinations, carrying with them not just physical possessions and practical knowledge, but fragments of a spiritual tradition that had taken centuries to develop and would require centuries more to fully restore. The palace that had been the center of their world for 7 generations would be abandoned to the elements, its rooms and corridors gradually returning to the mountain from which they had been carved. But the wisdom that had been accumulated within those walls would begin a journey that would carry it to the edges of the known world and beyond, waiting for a time when humanity would once again be ready to receive the gifts that the kingdom had preserved through the darkness of its voluntary dissolution. Echoes in the mist the years that followed the great diaspora passed, like pages turning in a book written in a language that few could read. Across the Korean peninsula and beyond, in the scattered communities where the kingdom's former subjects had made their new homes, fragments of the old traditions took root in alien soil, adapting and evolving in ways that would have been impossible to predict during the final ceremony in the throne room. In the southern kingdom of Silla, master craftsman Jianseal and his family established themselves as builders of Buddhist temples, their reputation growing with each structure they completed. Visitors to these temples often remarked on the unusual sense of peace and spiritual presence they experienced, never suspecting that the foundation stones incorporated fragments of jade that had once anchored the throne of whispered stones. The family maintained their sacred trust across 3 generations, with each eldest son receiving not only the technical knowledge of their craft but the deeper understanding of their role as guardians of hidden wisdom. The throne's foundation stone remained concealed within the main altar of the Temple of Eternal Harmony, its presence gradually influencing the development of Korean Buddhist architecture in ways that created subtle but unmistakable connections to the shamanic traditions of the Forgotten Kingdom. Meanwhile, in the Western Mountains, the descendants of royal astronomer Biology had become renowned among Taoist scholars for their uncanny ability to predict celestial events and their deep understanding of the relationship between cosmic cycles and human spiritual development. Their astronomical instruments, including the disguised back panel of the ancient throne, were consulted by scholars from across East Asia, who came seeking guidance on everything from agricultural planning to the timing of important ceremonies. The family's influence on the development of Chinese astronomical and mathematical knowledge was profound but carefully concealed. They introduced concepts and techniques that appeared to be natural extensions of existing Taoist thought, never revealing that their innovations were based on shamanic wisdom that had been preserved from a vanished Korean kingdom in the eastern coastal regions. The healing lineage descended from Master Yako had become legendary for their ability to treat ailments that conventional medicine could not touch. Their portable shrine, which concealed the throne's left armrest, accompanied them on circuits that covered hundreds of miles, bringing both physical healing and spiritual guidance to communities that had never heard of the kingdom that had originally developed these techniques. The family's medical knowledge evolved as it encountered new diseases, different herbs, and unfamiliar cultural contexts, but it retained its essential foundation in the understanding of health as a balance between spiritual and physical forces. Their influence on the development of traditional Korean medicine was subtle but pervasive, introducing concepts and practices that would persist for centuries without their true origins being recognized. That the musical guardians who had carried the throne's right armrest to the Northern Territories found their new home among tribes that still maintained strong shamanic traditions, though these were beginning to fragment under pressure from more organized religious systems. The family's role became that of preservers and synthesizers, helping to maintain the essential elements of shamanic practice while adapting them to changing circumstances. Their ritual instruments, which incorporated the encoded wisdom of the ancient throne, became focal points for ceremonies that served multiple tribes and communities. The music they created carried subtle harmonics that induced states of consciousness conducive to spiritual communication, helping to maintain the connection between human and divine realms, even as the old traditions faced increasing challenges. The scholarly lineage that had carried the throne's headrest to the Chinese heartland established itself as a repository of ancient wisdom, attracting students from across the empire who came seeking knowledge of classical texts and philosophical traditions. Their private library, with its disguised bookstand carved from royal jade, became a center of learning that influenced the development of Chinese thought in ways that are still being discovered by modern historians. The family's approach to scholarship was unique in its integration of intellectual analysis with spiritual practice. Students who studied with them found their understanding deepened not just through rational inquiry, but through meditation and contemplation that allowed them to access forms of knowledge that transcended ordinary academic learning. The warrior Guardians who had taken the first seat cushion to the Japanese islands found their new home in a culture that was just beginning to develop the martial traditions that would eventually become known as Bushido. Their family dojo, with its hidden foundation containing royal jade, became a training ground for samurai who learned not just fighting techniques, but the spiritual disciplines that would allow them to maintain their honor and effectiveness under the most challenging circumstances. The martial arts that developed from this lineage retained their connection to shamanic wisdom through practices that appeared to be purely physical, but actually served to cultivate spiritual awareness and psychic sensitivity. Warriors trained in these techniques often reported experiences of heightened intuition and supernatural protection that they attributed to the intensity of their physical training, never suspecting that they were accessing fragments of an ancient Korean spiritual tradition, the seventh guardian lineage, whose destination had been kept secret even from the other families, had apparently traveled further than anyone had imagined possible. Fragmentary accounts from Tibetan monasteries, Central Asian trading posts, and even Indian ashrams mention mysterious Korean masters who appeared at crucial moments in their spiritual development, offering guidance and techniques that seemed impossibly advanced for their apparent origins. These masters never stayed long in any one place, and they left behind no lasting institutions or formal teachings, but their influence could be traced through the subtle improvements in meditation techniques, the unexpected insights into the nature of consciousness, and the remarkable spiritual attainments of students who had encountered them. The second seat cushion of the ancient throne appeared to be traveling constantly, its wisdom being shared with advanced practitioners across the Asian continent, while never being fully revealed to any single tradition. As decades passed and became centuries, the scattered throne components continued to influence the development of spiritual, artistic, and intellectual traditions throughout East Asia. But their influence was so subtle and so thoroughly integrated into existing cultural patterns that even the descendants of the guardian lineages sometimes lost conscious awareness of their true purpose. The knowledge of the throne's existence began to fade into legend and myth. Stories were told of a mystical Korean kingdom that had possessed wisdom beyond normal human understanding, but these stories were increasingly dismissed as folk tales, created to explain unusual artifacts or remarkable individuals whose abilities seemed to transcend ordinary limitations. Yet the spiritual programming that had been implanted during the final ceremony continued to operate across generations. Individuals who encountered the guardian families or their preserved artifacts experienced inexplicable feelings of recognition and reverence. Artists and scholars working in traditions that have been influenced by the scattered wisdom found themselves drawn to research and creative work that gradually reconstructed elements of the ancient teachings, usually without conscious awareness of what they were doing. The most remarkable aspect of this long preservation was the way it maintained not just specific knowledge and techniques, but the essential spirit of the original tradition. The shamanic understanding of reality as a seamless integration of spiritual and material forces. The recognition of consciousness as the fundamental principle underlying all existence, and the commitment to serving the highest good rather than merely personal interests. All of these continued to influence human development through the hidden presence of the scattered throne components. Dreams began to connect the guardian lineages across vast distances of space and time. Children born into the families would sometimes wake with vivid memories of places they had never seen and knowledge they had never been taught. Scholars working in completely different fields would simultaneously develop insights that complemented each other in ways that suggested coordination from some deeper level of consciousness. As the centuries passed and the great wheel of cosmic time began its slow turn toward a new age of spiritual awakening, signs began to appear that the time for restoration might eventually come. Individuals with no apparent connection to any of the guardian lineages began to report dreams of a black jade throne surrounded by standing stones. Archaeological discoveries in Korea uncovered foundations and artifacts that matched descriptions from the ancient legends. Scholars studying Asian spiritual traditions began to notice patterns and connections that suggested the existence of a sophisticated system of wisdom preservation that had operated across multiple cultures and centuries. The 7 components of the throne of whispered stones remained hidden in their scattered locations, protected by families who had maintained their sacred trust across dozens of generations. But the spiritual forces they had preserved were beginning to stir, responding to the changing consciousness of humanity and the approaching end of the long dark age that had begun with the kingdom's voluntary dissolution. Whether the throne would ever be physically reassembled remained a mystery known only to the cosmic forces that governed the great cycles of spiritual development. But the wisdom it had preserved was already beginning to emerge in new forms, adapted to the needs of a very different world. A world that was finally beginning to rediscover its connection to the spiritual realms that the ancient Korean kingdom had never stopped serving. Even in its apparent absence, the mist that had concealed the kingdom's final resting place for so many centuries was beginning to thin, and attentive observers could sometimes glimpse shadows and shapes that suggested the presence of something magnificent waiting to be fully revealed when the time was right and the world was ready to receive such gifts. And so our story ends where all true stories end, not with conclusions, but with possibilities, not with answers, but with questions that invite further exploration, not with certainty, but with the kind of uncertainty that makes room for wonder and keeps the future open to transformation. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the mists of ancient history and the realm of possibilities that exists where fact and legend meet. As you drift off to sleep, let your dreams carry you through those mountain passes where the forgotten kingdom once thrived, where wisdom was preserved through sacrifice, and where the patient guardians still maintained their vigil across the centuries. Sleep well, and may your rest be filled with the peace that comes from knowing that some things of value are never truly lost, only transformed and hidden until the time comes for their rediscovery. Good night.